Grease and stale beer clung to the diner's stagnant air. No one noticed the slight man in the corner booth until the floorboards groaned under 265 pounds of pure, vein-popping muscle. A shadow fell over the table. The clinking of silverware stopped. Violence was on the menu. Cigarette smoke drifted in lazy blue ribbons toward the yellowed ceiling tiles of the diner. It was past midnight on a Tuesday in Los Angeles, the kind of hour where the city's glamour stripped off its makeup and revealed the exhausted, pockmarked skin beneath. Phoenix sat in the corner booth, a plate of severely overcooked flank steak and dry white rice sitting in front of him. He wasn't eating for pleasure. He was eating to refuel a machine that burned calories at a terrifying, relentless rate. Across from him sat James, an old training partner with tired eyes and a half-empty glass of iced tea. They weren't talking. They didn't need to. The ambient noise of the diner, the harsh scrape of a spatula on a flat-top grill, the irregular skipping bass line from a corner jukebox, the wet cough of a truck driver 2 booths down, filled the silence perfectly. Phoenix methodically sawed at the gray meat. His knuckles were raw, the skin split over the index and middle joints from an aggressive session with a canvas-heavy bag earlier that afternoon. He was exhausted. A deep, bone-aching fatigue settled at the base of his skull. The studio executives had spent the last 8 hours questioning his accent, his height, his screen presence. They wanted him broader, taller, less severe. They wanted him to be something he fundamentally wasn't. The anger had been a low, persistent hum in his chest all day. Then, the diner's front door swung open. The brass bells tied to the handle didn't just jingle, they violently clattered against the glass. The man who walked in seemed to bend the doorframe around him. He was a mountain of a human being, a literal wall of hypertrophic tissue packed into a gray sweatshirt that had its sleeves violently sheared off at the shoulders. 265 pounds, easy, maybe more. His deltoids looked like cantaloupes stuffed under the fabric. His name was Bradley. Phoenix didn't know his name yet, but he recognized the type instantly. The walk was a dead giveaway. That wide, rolling gait forced by thighs too thick to swing in a straight line, arms hanging away from the torso because the lats simply wouldn't allow them to rest naturally against the ribs. Bradley carried his body like it was a weapon he was desperate to show off. Phoenix didn't look up from his steak. He didn't want the trouble. He felt a familiar, irritating prickle of adrenaline pooling in his gut. Not tonight, he thought, forcing a tough piece of meat down his dry throat. Let it go. But Bradley had already stopped moving toward the counter. He had frozen in the center of the linoleum aisle. The huge man tilted his head, his thick neck straining against the collar of his shirt. He was looking at the corner booth. "Well, look at this," Bradley said. His voice was a wet, gravelly baritone that cut through the diner's low hum. The sound of the spatula on the grill ceased. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired orthopedic shoes, stopped wiping down the counter. The shift in atmospheric pressure was instantaneous. Bradley took 3 heavy steps toward the booth. Phoenix could smell him now, a pungent mix of old sweat, cheap menthol aftershave, and the distinct sour metallic odor of a body processing too much animal protein. Bradley stopped right at the edge of their table. His shadow entirely eclipsed the overhead pendant light, plunging Phoenix's plate into darkness. "You're that TV guy," Bradley stated. It wasn't a question. "The sidekick. The little guy who chops the wood." James sighed softly, staring at his iced tea. He shifted his weight, preparing for the inevitable. Phoenix stopped cutting his steak. He placed his knife and fork down on the ceramic plate. The faint clink sounded loud in the suddenly quiet room. He didn't look up at Bradley's face. He looked at the man's forearm, currently resting on the edge of the Formica table. The veins were thick as garden hoses, wrapped around muscle bellies that were undeniably impressive in their sheer volume. But to Phoenix's trained eye, it was dead weight. It was vanity. It was a sports car with no steering wheel. "I'm eating," Phoenix said. His tone wasn't serene or mystical. It was clipped, irritated, and deeply tired. Bradley scoffed, a wet sound from the back of his throat. He leaned in closer. The sheer mass of his chest pressed into the edge of the table, causing the cheap metal legs to groan and shift. Phoenix's water glass trembled, ripples distorting the ice cubes. "They make you look bigger on television, you know," Bradley continued, looking down at Phoenix with a mixture of amusement and genuine disdain. What do you weigh, tough guy? $140 soaking wet? My left leg weighs more than you." Phoenix felt the internal contradiction tearing at him. The philosophy he preached, the ink he spilled in his notebooks about flowing like water, about letting insults pass through him, all of it felt cheap and hollow in the face of this immediate sweating indignity. He wanted to be the bigger man, but the raw, ugly truth was that his ego was a fragile, dangerous thing. He hated being patronized. He hated the assumption that mass equated to superiority. Phoenix finally looked up. He locked eyes with Bradley. The bodybuilder's eyes were bloodshot, pupils slightly dilated. There was a desperate neediness in them. Bradley didn't just want to insult Phoenix. He needed to diminish him to validate the thousands of hours he'd spent torturing his own body under a heavy iron. "Weight is just gravity pulling on you," Phoenix said, his voice dropping an octave, completely devoid of warmth. "It doesn't mean you know how to use it." Bradley's jaw tightened. The insult bypassed his brain and went straight to his ego. He slammed a massive calloused palm flat onto the table. The water glass tipped, spilling a cold puddle across the laminated surface, soaking into the paper napkins. "You think all that fancy kicking shit works in the real world?" Bradley sneered, leaning his face in so close Phoenix could feel the heat radiating off his skin. "I grab a hold of you, little man, and I snap you in half like a dry twig. I don't care how fast you are." James tensed, his hand sliding to the edge of the table. Phoenix didn't blink. He felt his heart rate spike, but his breathing remained shallow and slow through his nose. He noted the angle of Bradley's hips, the locked position of the man's knees, the heavy reliance on the right arm planted on the table for balance. A physics equation materialized in Phoenix's mind: leverage, structure, collapse. It would take precisely 4 pounds of pressure applied to the side of Bradley's locked knee to shatter the joint completely. The temptation was sickeningly sweet. "Please step back from the table," Phoenix said. It was a warning, tight and vibrating with repressed intent. Bradley laughed, a booming, hollow sound. "Or what, Cato? You gonna do a backflip? You gonna chop my hand off?" He reached out, his thick, sausage-like fingers grasping the collar of Phoenix's light cotton jacket. That was the breaking point. The philosopher died. The street fighter from Kowloon took the wheel. Phoenix didn't swat the hand away. That would require meeting force with force, a losing battle against a man who benched 400 pounds. Instead, Phoenix shifted his shoulders a fraction of an inch to the left, relaxing his torso completely. The sudden lack of resistance caused Bradley to pitch forward slightly, his balance betraying him. In that microsecond of instability, Phoenix stood up. He moved from seated to standing in a single fluid motion that seemed to defy the heavy, greasy gravity of the diner. He didn't brush against the table. He didn't make a sound. Suddenly, he was just there, occupying the space intimately close to Bradley. The bodybuilder blinked, startled by the sudden proximity. He was a full 8 inches taller, looking down at the crown of Phoenix's dark hair, but somehow the dynamic in the room had violently inverted. Bradley was massive, taking up the space. Phoenix was dense, a black hole threatening to collapse it. "Not in here," Phoenix said quietly, his voice barely a whisper against the hum of the refrigerators. "There are people eating." He didn't wait for a response. Phoenix stepped around the hulking man, his cheap canvas shoes making a soft shh sound against the linoleum. He walked toward the back of the diner, past the restrooms, pushing open the heavy dented steel door that led to the alleyway. Bradley stood frozen for a second, his brain struggling to process the abrupt shift in the script. He had expected a shouting match, maybe a scuffle broken up by the fry cook. He hadn't expected to be calmly invited into an alley by a man half his size. The waitress stared at him. James was still sitting, quietly sipping his tea. A flush of hot, prickly embarrassment crawled up Bradley's thick neck. He couldn't back down now, not in front of an audience. Grunting something unintelligible, he turned and lumbered after Phoenix, his heavy work boots slamming against the floorboards. The alley behind the diner was a stark contrast to the stifling interior. The Los Angeles night air was cool, carrying the bitter tang of smog and the rotting sweetness from the overflowing dumpsters pressed against the brick wall. A single neon sign from a neighboring liquor store flickered angrily, casting intermittent slashes of harsh red light across the cracked asphalt. Phoenix was already waiting. He stood about 10 feet from the steel door, his hands resting lightly at his sides. He wasn't in a stance. There were no fists raised, no bouncing on the toes. He looked utterly relaxed, but it was the relaxation of a coiled spring pulled to its absolute limit. His jaw was clenched so tight, his teeth ached. He hated himself for being out here. He had a family. He had a career hanging by a thread. He was risking it all because a meathead spilled his water. But as the heavy steel door slammed shut behind Bradley, echoing like a gunshot in the narrow brick corridor, the self-loathing evaporated. Only the geometry of violence remained. Bradley stepped into the red neon glare, breathing heavily through his mouth. The walk to the back had already slightly elevated his heart rate. His massive chest heaved up and down. "All right, Hollywood," Bradley spat, cracking his knuckles with a sound like snapping kindling. "You want to show off out here where no one can see you cry?" Phoenix didn't speak. He watched the way Bradley's shoulders hitched. He watched the heavy, flat-footed stance. Muscle requires oxygen. The bigger the muscle, the more fuel it demands to operate. Bradley was a gas-guzzling engine sitting at a red light, revving high. Phoenix was a razor blade. "Come on!" Bradley roared, his patience snapping. He lunged. It wasn't a tactical advance. It was a raw, unadulterated projection of mass. Bradley threw a sweeping right hook, his arm acting like a wrecking ball tethered to a crane. The punch tore through the air, carrying enough kinetic energy to decapitate a mannequin. Phoenix didn't block it. Blocking a 265-pound man's momentum was suicidal. Instead, Phoenix dropped his weight. He didn't just duck, he sank into the asphalt, his knees bending at a severe, unnatural angle while his spine remained perfectly straight. The massive fist whistled over his head, the displaced air ruffling his hair. Bradley's momentum carried him forward. His fist hit nothing but smog, throwing his heavy torso off axis. His left foot slammed onto the gravel to stop his forward fall. Before Bradley could retract the missed arm, Phoenix moved. He didn't strike the head or the chest. He pivot-stepped to the outside of Bradley's lead leg and delivered a sharp, snapping kick to the back of the bodybuilder's knee, the exact spot he had calculated inside the diner. It wasn't meant to break the joint, only to deaden the nerve. A sickening smack echoed off the brick walls. Bradley let out a sharp, breathless grunt. His leg buckled instantly, unable to support the massive load of his upper body. He stumbled heavily to his left, his shoulder crashing violently into the rough brick wall of the alley. The impact rattled his teeth. "Son of a—" Bradley gasped, immediately pushing off the wall. He was furious now. The red mist had descended. He spun around, swinging wildly with both arms, trying to grab, to grapple, to turn the encounter into a wrestling match where his sheer gravity would win. But Phoenix was already gone. Phoenix had glided backward, maintaining a precise, maddening distance of exactly 3 feet. He was a ghost in the red light. Bradley swung again, a heavy, looping left hand. Phoenix swayed slightly to the right. The fist missed by an inch. Bradley lunged, trying to tackle him around the waist. Phoenix pivoted on his heel, floating to the side like a matador, letting the massive body stumble past him. "Stand still!" Bradley roared, the sound echoing down the narrow concrete canyon. But Phoenix just kept moving. Small, economic shifts of weight. He watched the sweat instantly bead and pour down Bradley's flushed face. He heard the sudden, ragged intake of breath. It had been less than 30 seconds, but the oxygen debt was already calling to collect. Bradley's massive chest was rising and falling in frantic, desperate spasms. The muscles that looked so intimidating in the diner were now suffocating their owner, demanding air that his panicked lungs couldn't supply fast enough. Phoenix stopped moving. He stood perfectly still in the center of the alley, his breathing as calm and steady as it had been at the table. He waited. The real fight hadn't even started, but the ending was already written in the heavy wheezing sounds bouncing off the alley walls. Blood pounded in Bradley's ears, a rhythmic, deafening roar that drowned out the hum of the nearby freeway. Panic, cold and sharp, began to slice through the hot fog of his rage. He was drowning on dry land. His massive pectoral muscles, built to push iron bars in sterile gymnasiums, were now a prison cage, heavy and rigid, restricting the expansion of his lungs. He tasted pennies. The thick, sour saliva coating his tongue felt like glue. Phoenix stood 3 feet away, a silhouette etched against the flickering red neon. He wasn't even sweating. The canvas jacket hung perfectly still on his slight frame. That stillness was an insult. It was a terrifying, undeniable proof of the vast chasm between gym strength and applied violence. Bradley swallowed hard, his throat clicking. His right knee throbbed with a sickening deep tissue ache where Phoenix's shoe had snapped against the peroneal nerve. The leg felt disconnected, a useless slab of meat trembling under his own weight. He needed to hit this arrogant little man. He just needed one clean shot. The mental math of the bodybuilder dictated that mass must conquer speed eventually. He roared, a wet, desperate sound, and threw himself forward. This wasn't a punch. It was a falling avalanche of flesh, arms wide, seeking to envelop, crush, and smother. Phoenix didn't retreat this time. He stepped into the chaotic collapse of Bradley's mass. As Bradley's thick arms attempted to close like a bear trap, Phoenix slipped inside the wide arc. The proximity was instant and violent. Phoenix brought his lead hand up, not in a closed fist, but an open palm. He didn't strike the jaw. He slapped the space directly over Bradley's left ear. The sound was a sharp, concussive crack, like a dry leather belt snapping against a wet stone. Air forced violently into the ear canal ruptured Bradley's equilibrium immediately. The giant's eyes rolled back in their sockets for a fraction of a second. His inner ear screamed, sending chaotic, mismatched signals to his brain. Vertigo hit him like a physical wall. The alley tilted. The red neon sign blurred into a continuous, bloody streak across his vision. Before Bradley could process the sickening spin of the world, Phoenix moved his hips. Short, brutal, and entirely devoid of cinematic flair. He drove the point of his elbow straight into the center of Bradley's sternum. It wasn't a killing blow, but a precise disruption of the diaphragm. All the remaining air in Bradley's lungs exploded outward in a pathetic, wet wheeze. The 265-pound man folded inward. His hands instinctively released their grasp on the empty air, rushing down to clutch his chest. He fell to his knees, the thick denim of his jeans tearing violently against the jagged asphalt. Small, sharp pebbles embedded themselves into his kneecaps, but he couldn't feel them over the agonizing spasm in his chest and the dizzying spin in his head. Phoenix stepped back, re-establishing that maddening 3-foot gap. He looked down at the man kneeling in the trash-strewn alley. Internal contradictions gnawed at Phoenix's stomach. He looked at his own fists, the knuckles still taped beneath his jacket. What was this proving? He was a father, a husband, a man who spent his days reading philosophy and poring over treatises on biomechanics. Yet, here he was, standing over a choking, humiliated man in an alley that smelled like rancid grease and urine. The anger that had fueled him in the diner, the resentment toward the studio executives, the exhaustion of constantly proving his worth, now tasted like ash in his mouth. He wasn't teaching a lesson. He was just participating in the same ugly, primal dominance game he claimed to despise. Bradley was on all fours now. Thick ropes of saliva hung from his lips, pooling onto the dirty asphalt. He was dry heaving. His massive lats shuddered with every agonizing, fruitless attempt to draw oxygen into his paralyzed diaphragm. The sheer density of his musculature was actively working against him, trapping the heat inside his core. He looked like a stranded whale collapsing under the crushing pressure of its own blubber. "Get up," Phoenix said. His voice lacked any triumph. It was flat, carrying a hollow ring of disappointment. Bradley couldn't get up. He could barely lift his head. The red neon light cast harsh shadows over the deep lines of pain etched into his face. The aggressive, bullying confidence from the diner was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, unadulterated panic of an animal realizing it is lost. He managed to tilt his head upward, looking at Phoenix with bloodshot, watering eyes. There was no hatred left in them, only confusion. He didn't understand how a man who weighed 135 pounds could dismantle him without seemingly breaking a sweat. It violated every law of physics Bradley had built his entire identity around. Phoenix watched the realization sink in. The physical fight was over, but the psychological demolition was absolute. A stray cat, mangy and missing half an ear, darted across the far end of the alley, its claws clicking softly against a rusted tin can. The sound pulled Phoenix out of his hyper-focused state. He became acutely aware of the chill in the air, biting through his thin jacket. The adrenaline, which had sharpened his senses to a razor's edge, was beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in his joints. Violence is a hungry ghost. It eats the loser's flesh and the winner's soul. Phoenix squeezed his eyes shut for a second. The memory of sun-baked tiles and the smell of jasmine tea felt a million miles away from this pathetic scene. Bradley let out another terrible, racking cough, a speck of blood dotting the saliva on the ground. The giant's forearms, thick as tree trunks, trembled violently as they struggled to hold his upper body off the pavement. "Enough," Phoenix whispered, more to himself than to the man bleeding on the ground. Footsteps crunched across asphalt gravel. Phoenix ignored the noise. He knew that dragging sound posed zero threat. Bradley shifted his massive weight, attempting to crawl backward toward a cold brick wall for physical support. Thick hands blindly pawed at rough, dirty masonry. His breathing sounded horrific. It was a ragged, wet rasp, resembling a rusty saw blade tearing into damp timber. Phoenix watched him with detached sorrow. Copious lactic acid flooded Bradley's strained muscles, causing involuntary tremors. His triceps twitched erratically beneath sweaty skin. This was brutal reality, stripped of cinematic angles and choreographed grace. Biology simply failed under immense stress. Violence felt ugly, completely undignified, and entirely pointless. Bradley moaned softly. His words sounded slurred and incredibly thick. He complained loudly about his ringing ear. He finally managed to slump back against dirty brick, his heavy legs splayed outward like a discarded rag doll. His gray sweatshirt was soaked through completely. Dark patches of stale sweat highlighted the grotesque, useless, overgrown mass of his huge pectorals. He looked upward, completely broken inside. He asked if Phoenix felt happy now. He called him a killer, spitting out bitter words while wincing from a bruised sternum bone. Phoenix walked slowly toward the defeated giant. He purposefully refused to square his slim shoulders. He kept his chest completely relaxed. He stopped just out of striking range and crouched down close. His flat heels remained planted firmly on cracked asphalt, proving natural ankle mobility Bradley lacked. Flickering neon lights bathed them both in crimson, mimicking old dried blood. Phoenix spoke softly. He felt zero residual anger, only deep, weary cynicism settling into his bones. He told Bradley that he had absolutely nothing to prove. He stated raw facts without any arrogant ego, delivering cold truth to a crushed man. Bradley walked over willingly, placed his aggressive hands on a stranger, and wanted to test his bulky armor against a sharpened sword. Now he understood the massive difference. The injured bodybuilder let his heavy head loll backward against rough masonry. He possessed zero physical energy to argue anymore. Absolute certainty echoing in Phoenix's quiet voice terrified him significantly more than those devastating strikes had. Phoenix stood back up swiftly. He brushed a speck of invisible gray dust from the knee of his dark trousers. The movement was fastidious and incredibly sharp, returning fully to his meticulous, image-obsessed nature immediately. He looked down at Bradley one final time tonight. He instructed the fallen man to apply cold ice to his swollen neck immediately. He warned him not to eat solid food until tomorrow morning because his injured jaw would swell substantially. Phoenix did not wait for any verbal acknowledgement regarding this clinical medical advice. He merely turned his slim back on the massive, utterly defeated muscle man. He walked steadily toward that dented steel door connecting the alleyway to the diner. He firmly pushed it wide open. Clattering brass bells announced his return, contrasting sharply against the heavy outside silence. Stepping indoors felt incredibly jarring. Suffocating heat hit him instantly, carrying thick waves of rancid fryer grease, stale cigarette smoke, and burnt black coffee. That irregular bass line from a corner jukebox continued thumping mindlessly. An exhausted truck driver 2 booths away coughed wetly. It felt as if those past 3 minutes had occurred within some bizarre alternate dimension. Absolutely nothing had changed inside. The spinning world never paused simply because 2 angry men engaged in pathetic, violent struggles across dirty asphalt. Phoenix walked quietly down the sticky linoleum aisle. A terrified waitress stared at him, holding a damp cleaning rag. She looked wildly from Phoenix toward the steel door and then back toward Phoenix again. Her eyes were impossibly wide. He ignored her frantic stare entirely. He slid smoothly back into his corner booth, hearing cheap red vinyl groan slightly beneath him. James remained seated exactly where Phoenix had initially left him. The iced tea level was slightly lower now. Melted ice cubes heavily diluted the warm amber liquid. Phoenix looked downward at his white ceramic plate. The severely overcooked flank steak had grown completely cold. A thin, repulsive film of coagulated white fat rested atop brown congealed thick gravy. He picked up heavy silverware. Cold metal felt unnatural against his raw knuckles. Skin covering his index joint stung sharply. It provided a painful reminder of canvas-heavy bags, not the bleeding man outside. James cleared his tired throat very quietly. He refused to ask what happened outdoors. He possessed zero need for spoken details. The simple fact that Phoenix walked back indoors totally alone, breathing calmly, communicated the entire violent story perfectly. James finally spoke, his steady voice barely rising above the constant hiss of hot grills. He mentioned their early morning studio script read, an exhausting daily schedule. Phoenix cut another small piece of gray meat. He chewed methodically. It tasted like damp cardboard. He swallowed it alongside lukewarm water from a glass Bradley nearly spilled earlier. He told James he already felt incredibly tired. Phoenix stared through a dirty window pane, watching distant red taillights smear through thick gray smog. Studio executives would call him too small again. Casting directors would demand exaggerated accents constantly. Beating a pathetic meathead outside fixed absolutely nothing regarding his struggling Hollywood career. It provided zero spiritual peace. It merely consumed precious fragments of his limited daily energy without offering any real reward. He placed his metal fork down. That sharp clink matched the identical noise made minutes prior. Phoenix closed his dark eyes, actively forcing tight shoulders to drop low. He expelled residual combat tension from his aching forearms. He breathed deeply through his nose, holding stale diner oxygen inside tired lungs for 4 seconds, then exhaling very slowly. He preached flowing like gentle water constantly. Tonight, however, that water felt incredibly heavy, stagnant, and impossibly cold. He hated his ego. James urged him to finish eating protein. Phoenix grabbed his cold fork again, preparing his bruised, battered physical body for tomorrow. The clash between ego and discipline is a fight we all face, whether in an alleyway or our own minds. If this raw look at the human side of a legend resonated with you, hit that like button to let the algorithm know. Share this with someone who appreciates the gritty reality behind the martial arts myths. And make sure to subscribe for more deep dive storytelling into the moments history tried to polish over. Stay grounded.